The mess hall buzzed with the usual evening chatter as soldiers lined up for dinner. Steam rose from aluminum trays filled with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans that had seen better days. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez moved through the line with practiced efficiency, her combat boots making soft thuds against the polished concrete floor. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 6 years of military service, 3 deployments, and more combat experience than most of her male counterparts. She found an empty spot at a table near the back, setting her tray down next to Corporal Jenkins and Private Rodriguez. The conversation around the table was typical for a Tuesday evening. Complaints about the upcoming field exercise, speculation about weekend leave, and the eternal debate over which branch of the military had it toughest. "I'm telling you, the Marines have the highest kill count per capita," Jenkins declared, stabbing his fork into his meatloaf with unnecessary force. "It's just statistics." "Statistics my ass," Rodriguez countered, leaning back in his chair. "The Army sees way more action. We've been in every major conflict for the past century." Maria ate quietly, listening to the familiar banter. She had learned early in her career that sometimes it was better to observe than participate in these conversations. Her dark eyes moved across the faces around the table. Young men, mostly full of bravado and theories about warfare that came from movies and video games rather than experience. "What about you, Gonzalez?" Private Thompson called out from across the table. "You've been quiet over there. What do you think?" Maria looked up from her tray, chewing slowly. "About what?" "Kill counts. Who has the most confirmed kills in our unit?" The question hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever the conversation turned to this particular topic. She took a sip of water, buying herself time. "I don't keep track of things like that," she said finally. Sergeant Williams, a stocky man with graying temples, chuckled from the head of the table. "Come on, Gonzalez. Everyone keeps track. It's human nature." "Not everyone," Maria replied, her voice steady but with an edge that made Rodriguez glance at her sideways. The conversation might have moved on if Lieutenant Morrison hadn't chosen that moment to join them. Fresh from officer training and eager to prove himself, Morrison had the unfortunate habit of saying exactly the wrong thing at the wrong time. "Kill counts," he said, sliding into an empty chair. "That's a man's game. Women don't really have kill counts worth talking about." The words dropped into the conversation like a grenade with the pin pulled. Maria's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Around the table, the other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some had served with Maria long enough to know better than to make assumptions about her capabilities. Morrison, oblivious to the sudden tension, continued. "I mean, no offense to our female soldiers, but combat is different for men and women. We're built for it. It's biology." Jenkins cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, what's your point, Lieutenant?" Maria interrupted, setting her fork down with deliberate care. Morrison turned to her with a patronizing smile. "My point is that when we talk about kill counts and combat effectiveness, we're really talking about the guys who do the heavy lifting. The real fighters." The mess hall seemed to grow quieter around them, as if other conversations were pausing to listen. Maria could feel eyes turning toward their table, could sense the anticipation building like pressure before a storm. "The real fighters," she repeated slowly. "Exactly. Look, I've read the reports. Women in combat roles are fine for support, for logistics, even for some light engagement. But when it comes to the serious business of warfare, when the bullets are flying and lives are on the line, it's the men who step up." Rodriguez was shaking his head slightly, trying to catch Morrison's eye. He had been with Maria in Kandahar. He had seen what she could do when the bullets started flying. "You think women can't handle real combat?" Maria asked, her voice deceptively calm. "I think women aren't designed for it the way men are. It's not their fault. It's just nature." Thompson, who had started this particular fire, was now desperately trying to put it out. "Maybe we should talk about something else." "No," Maria said, standing up. "The lieutenant has something to say. I'd like to hear it." Morrison, finally beginning to sense that he had stepped into dangerous territory, attempted to backtrack. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Sergeant. I'm just stating facts." "Facts," Maria nodded. "What facts would those be?" "Well, physical strength, for one thing. Upper body strength, bone density, muscle mass. These things matter in combat." "They do matter," Maria agreed. "What else?" "Aggression levels. Testosterone. The willingness to engage in violence. Men are naturally more aggressive. Naturally more aggressive, she repeated. And you think that makes them better fighters? I think it makes them more effective in combat situations, yes. Maria walked around the table slowly, her movements precise and controlled. The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter now, with more soldiers turning to watch the exchange. Tell me, Lieutenant, where did you serve your last deployment? Morrison's face flushed slightly. I haven't been deployed yet. I just finished officer training. Officer training, right? And your combat experience. I've completed all the required training exercises. Maria nodded again. I see. So your facts about women in combat come from what exactly? Textbooks? Simulation exercises? Call of Duty? That's not fair, Sergeant. The data is clear, the data. Maria stopped walking and faced him directly. Let me share some data with you, Lieutenant. The mess hall fell silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clattering to listen. Afghanistan, 2019. Forward Operating Base Chapman. Taliban fighters overran our perimeter during a coordinated attack. I was part of a 4-person team that held the eastern approach for 6 hours while reinforcements arrived. Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. During those 6 hours, we faced approximately 40 enemy combatants. The other 3 members of my team were men. Good soldiers, brave soldiers. By the end of the engagement, 2 of them were wounded and had to be evacuated. She paused, letting the silence stretch. I remained in position for the duration of the firefight. When it was over, we counted 17 enemy dead in our sector. 17 confirmed kills. Morrison's face had gone pale. But that was just one engagement, Lieutenant. Would you like to hear about the others? Sergeant, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Syria, 2020. Convoy escort duty through disputed territory. IED attack followed by small arms fire from 3 positions. My team was responsible for eliminating the northern position, while other units dealt with the remaining threats. Maria's voice remained steady, professional, but there was something in her eyes now that made Morrison shrink back in his chair. 6 enemy combatants in that position. All eliminated. My team? All female, Lieutenant. 3 women who you think aren't designed for combat. The silence in the mess hall was absolute now. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed muted. Iraq, 2021. Special Operations mission to extract a high-value target from a compound outside Mosul. Intelligence was wrong about the number of hostiles present. What was supposed to be a quick in and out became a 20-minute running gun battle through narrow streets. Morrison tried to speak, but no words came. 12 enemy combatants eliminated during the extraction. But by me personally, the mission was successful. The target was recovered alive. 0 casualties on our side. Maria leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. Should I continue, Lieutenant? Because I have 3 more deployments worth of data to share with you. Morrison shook his head quickly. No, Sergeant. That won't be necessary. Good. Because here's the thing about your facts and your biology and your natural aggression. Maria straightened up. In real combat, none of that matters as much as you think it does. She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each soldier present. What matters is training. What matters is discipline. What matters is the ability to remain calm under pressure and make good decisions when people are trying to kill you. What matters is marksmanship and tactics and the willingness to do what needs to be done to bring your team home alive. And what matters most, she continued, is never, ever underestimating your enemy based on assumptions about what they can or cannot do. Morrison stared down at his tray, his face burning with embarrassment. Now, Lieutenant, you asked about kill counts. Maria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried clearly through the silent mess hall. Mine is 37 confirmed, 15 probable. 3 deployments for combat zones, 12 major engagements. She picked up her tray and turned to go. And for the record, every single one of those kills was necessary, justified, and documented according to military protocol. I take no pleasure in them, and I don't consider them a game or a competition. As she walked toward the dish return, her footsteps echoed in the silence. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations starting to resume, the gradual return of normal mess hall noise. Rodriguez caught up with her at the exit. That was brutal, he said quietly. He needed to learn, Maria replied. Think he got the message. Maria glanced back toward the table where Morrison sat staring at his untouched food, his face still flushed with shame. We'll find out. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Rodriguez shook his head. 37 confirmed kills. I knew you were good, but damn. It's not something to be proud of, Rodriguez. Every one of those was someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. But they were trying to kill you. Doesn't make it easier to live with. They walked in silence for a moment, their boots crunching on the gravel path. For what it's worth, Rodriguez said finally, I'm glad you were there in Kandahar. Don't know if we would have made it out without you. Maria nodded, but didn't respond. She never knew how to respond when people said things like that. She had done her job, nothing more, nothing less. The fact that it had saved lives was what mattered. Back in the mess hall, the conversation at Morrison's table had resumed, but it was different now. Subdued. Thompson was explaining to Morrison about Maria's service record, about the commendations and the Purple Hearts and the Bronze Star with V device for valor. She's the real deal, sir, Jenkins was saying. Probably the best soldier in the unit, male or female. Morrison pushed his food around his tray, his appetite gone. I had no idea. That's kind of the point, Williams said from across the table. She doesn't advertise it, doesn't brag, just does her job. I feel like an idiot. You should, Rodriguez had returned and caught the end of the conversation. But you can learn from it. That's what matters. Morrison looked up at him. What should I do? Apologize. Publicly if possible. And then listen more and talk less for a while. As the evening wore on and the mess hall emptied, Morrison found himself thinking about Maria's words, about the difference between theory and reality, between training and actual combat. He thought about the 37 lives that had ended at the business end of her rifle, and the lives she had saved by taking them. He thought about assumptions and prejudice and the dangerous gap between what people believed and what was actually true. Most of all, he thought about the calm professionalism in her voice as she recounted events that would have broken lesser soldiers. In her quarters, Maria sat on her bunk, writing in a journal she had kept since her first deployment. It was a practice her therapist had recommended, a way to process the experiences that couldn't be shared in casual conversation. Today I had to remind a young officer that combat doesn't discriminate based on gender, she wrote. I don't enjoy these confrontations, but they seem necessary. People need to understand that courage and skill aren't determined by biology. She paused, pen hovering over the page. 37 confirmed kills. Sometimes I wonder if that number makes me strong or if it makes me broken. I suppose it doesn't matter. What matters is that I did what was necessary to protect the people counting on me. She closed the journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve and capabilities. But tonight, she had stood up for herself and for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't strong enough, wasn't tough enough, wasn't built for the fight. And maybe, just maybe, one young lieutenant had learned something valuable about the dangers of assumption and the reality of modern warfare. The next morning came early, as all mornings did in the military. Maria was already dressed and making her bunk when the first bugle call echoed across the base. Her routine was precise and unchanging, up at 0530, dressed by 0540, bunk made to regulation standards by 0545. She moved through these motions with the automatic efficiency that came from years of practice, but her mind was elsewhere. The confrontation with Lieutenant Morrison in the mess hall had stirred up memories she usually kept buried. Memories of her first deployment, when she was young and eager to prove herself. Memories of the skeptical looks from male soldiers who questioned whether she belonged in their ranks. Memories of the weight of her rifle and the split-second decisions that had shaped her into the soldier she was today. At 0600, she made her way to the armory for weapons inspection. As the senior non-commissioned officer for Bravo Company, it was her responsibility to ensure that all equipment was properly maintained and accounted for. She had inherited this duty from her predecessor, Staff Sergeant Coleman, who had been rotated stateside after completing his tour. The armory was a long, narrow building filled with locked weapon racks and ammunition storage. The smell of gun oil and metal polish hung in the air, familiar and oddly comforting. Maria methodically checked each rifle, each sidearm, running her fingers along barrels and stocks with the practiced touch of someone who understood that a soldier's life depended on the reliability of their weapon. Private Thompson appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain. He had been one of the soldiers at the table last night, one of the ones who had watched the confrontation unfold with obvious discomfort. Sergeant Gonzalez? Lieutenant Morrison asked me to find you. Maria looked up from M4 carbine she was inspecting. What does he need? He wants to speak with you privately. In his office. She nodded and handed the rifle back to Thompson. Finish the inspection. Check the serial numbers against the log, and make sure everything is accounted for. Morrison's office was in the administrative building, a small room with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and walls covered with maps and duty rosters. When Maria knocked on the doorframe, she found him standing at the window, looking out at the morning formation taking place on the parade ground. You wanted to see me, sir? He turned around, and she could see immediately that he had not slept well. His uniform was immaculate, as always, but there were dark circles under his eyes and a haggard look to his face that spoke of a long, restless night. Close the door, please. She did as requested and stood at attention, waiting for him to speak. At ease, Sergeant. He gestured to one of the chairs. Please sit down. Maria remained standing. With respect, sir, I'm fine as I am. Morrison sat down heavily behind his desk and rubbed his forehead. About last night. What about it? I owe you an apology. A public one. That's not necessary, Lieutenant. Yes, it is. He looked up at her, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since the mess hall incident. What I said was ignorant and disrespectful, not just to you, but to every woman who has served in combat. Maria studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or manipulation. She had learned to read people quickly and accurately. It was a survival skill in both military and civilian life. What she saw in Morrison's expression was genuine remorse, and perhaps more importantly, the beginning of understanding. I appreciate that, sir. I've been thinking all night about what you said, about assumptions and real combat experience. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I realized that everything I thought I knew about warfare came from books and training exercises. I've never been shot at. I've never had to make life or death decisions under fire. Most officers start that way, Lieutenant. Experience comes with time, but I shouldn't have pretended to know things I don't. And I definitely shouldn't have made assumptions about your capabilities based on your gender. Morrison stood up and walked to the window again, his back to her. Can I ask you something? Yes, sir. How do you do it? How do you carry that kind of responsibility? The question caught her off guard. She had expected an apology, perhaps some awkward attempt at making amends. She had not expected vulnerability. What do you mean? 37 kills. That's 37 people who are dead because of decisions you made. How do you live with that? Maria was quiet for a long moment. It was not a question she was asked often, and it was not one she answered lightly. You don't live with it easily, she said finally. But you live with it because the alternative was worse. Worse how? Because if I hadn't made those decisions, if I hadn't pulled that trigger, then the people I was responsible for protecting would be dead instead. She moved to stand beside him at the window, watching as soldiers went through their morning drills on the parade ground below. Every kill I've made was to protect someone else. My unit, civilians, fellow soldiers. I didn't kill those people because I enjoyed it or because it made me feel powerful. I killed them because it was my job and because lives depended on me doing my job well. Morrison nodded slowly. Do you ever wonder about them? The people you killed? Every day. The honesty of her answer seemed to surprise him. I wonder if they have families. I wonder what their last thoughts were. I wonder if there was another way, some decision I could have made that would have saved everyone. She paused. But wondering doesn't change anything. What's done is done. How do you deal with that? Therapy helps. Writing helps. Remembering why I did what I did helps. She turned to face him, and focusing on the people who are still alive because of those decisions. Morrison was quiet for several minutes, processing what she had told him. Outside, the morning formation was concluding, and soldiers were dispersing to their various duties. There's something else, he said eventually. I want to make a public apology to you and to the other women in our unit. At this evening's formation, Maria considered this. A public apology would certainly send a message, but it would also draw more attention to the incident than she preferred. That's your choice, Lieutenant. But if you do it, make sure you mean it. Don't do it just because you think you should. I do mean it. What I said last night was wrong, and it reflected poorly on my leadership and on this unit. Then do what you think is right. She turned to leave, but Morrison called her name. Sergeant. Yes, sir. Would you be willing to help me understand? About combat, about what it's really like. Maria studied his face again. The request seemed genuine, but She had learned to be cautious about sharing too much of her experience with people who might not be ready to hear it. What do you want to know? Everything. I'm going to be leading soldiers into combat situations, and I don't want my ignorance to get anyone killed. The weight of responsibility in his voice was something she recognized. It was the same feeling she had carried since her first deployment, the knowledge that other people's lives would depend on her decisions and her competence. Combat isn't what you think it is, she began. It's not heroic or glorious or exciting. Most of the time, it's terrifying and chaotic and over very quickly. She sat down across from him, deciding that this conversation was worth having properly. The first thing you need to understand is that when bullets start flying, everything you learned in training goes out the window. Your heart rate spikes, your hearing changes, your vision tunnels. Some people freeze. Some people panic. The good ones do their job anyway. Morrison was listening intently, taking mental notes. The second thing is that split-second decisions have permanent consequences. When you're deciding whether to take a shot, you have maybe half a second to determine if that person is a threat. If you guess wrong, she shrugged. Either you die or an innocent person dies. How do you learn to make those decisions quickly enough? Training helps, but mostly it comes down to experience and instinct. You develop a feel for situations, for reading body language and environmental cues. But there's always uncertainty. She leaned back in her chair, remembering. My first kill was a 16-year-old boy in Afghanistan. He was carrying an AK-47 and moving toward our position. I had maybe 3 seconds to decide if he was a combatant or a civilian who had picked up a weapon for protection. Morrison waited for her to continue. I chose to engage. It was the right decision tactically. He was part of an attacking force. But he was still 16 years old. Still somebody's son. Do you regret it? I regret that it was necessary. I regret that a 16-year-old boy felt like his only option was to pick up a rifle and fight foreign soldiers. But I don't regret protecting my unit. She stood up, smoothing down her uniform. That's what you need to understand, Lieutenant. Every decision in combat comes with a cost. Your job as a leader is to minimize that cost while accomplishing your mission and protecting your people. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Is there anything I can read? Any resources that might help? Read everything you can about the conflict we're involved in. Learn the history, the politics, the culture. Understand why people are fighting and what they're fighting for. She paused at the door and talked to the soldiers who have been there. Really listen to what they tell you. Will you help with that? With my education? Maria considered the request. Morrison seemed genuinely committed to learning, and she had seen too many young officers make deadly mistakes because of ignorance and overconfidence. I'll think about it. As she left Morrison's office, Maria found herself reflecting on her own journey from naive young soldier to battle-hardened veteran. She remembered her first commanding officer, Captain Martinez, who had taken the time to mentor her and teach her the realities of military service. He had been tough but fair, demanding but supportive. His guidance had quite possibly saved her life more than once. The morning progressed with routine activities, equipment checks, training exercises, administrative duties. But Maria noticed something different in the way other soldiers interacted with her. Word of the previous night's confrontation had spread, as word always did in the close-knit environment of a military base. Some soldiers nodded respectfully when they passed her. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure how to act around her. Corporal Davis, one of the few other women in the company, approached her during the lunch break. Heard you gave Morrison a reality check last night, Davis said, falling in a step beside her as they walked toward the mess hall. News travels fast. Always does. For what it's worth, I'm glad somebody finally said something. I'm tired of pretending that comments like his don't matter. Maria glanced at her. Davis was a good soldier, competent, reliable, but still relatively new to combat operations. She had done one deployment in a support role and was eager to prove herself in a more active capacity. Comments like that will always exist, Maria said. The question is how we respond to them. By putting ignorant officers in their place, by doing our jobs better than anyone expects us to, by being so competent that people have no choice but to respect us. They entered the mess hall, which was buzzing with the usual midday energy. Maria noticed several soldiers glancing in her direction, some with curiosity, others with what looked like newfound respect. But sometimes you have to speak up, Davis continued. Sometimes silence just enables them. You're right, Maria agreed. Sometimes you do have to speak up, but you pick your battles carefully and when you do engage, you make sure you're fighting from a position of strength. They collected their lunch and found a table near the windows. As they ate, Davis asked the question that Maria had been expecting. Is it true? About your kill count? Maria chewed her food slowly, considering her answer. The number had become public knowledge now, which made her uncomfortable. She had never wanted to be known primarily for the people she had killed. It's true. 37 people. That's a lot. It's 37 too many, Maria replied. But it was necessary. Davis was quiet for a moment, processing this. Do you think I'm ready for that kind of responsibility? The question revealed the heart of Davis's concerns. Like many soldiers, she wanted to prove herself in combat, but was uncertain about her ability to handle the psychological and moral weight that came with taking lives. Nobody is ever ready for it, Maria said. But you prepare as much as you can, you trust your training, and you rely on your unit. And if the time comes, you do what you have to do. What if I freeze? What if I can't pull the trigger when it matters? Then you'll deal with it. One way or another, you'll deal with it. Maria met her eyes directly. But based on your training scores and your performance so far, I don't think that will be a problem. The confidence in her voice seemed to reassure Davis, whose shoulders relaxed slightly. Thanks, Sergeant. It helps to hear that from someone who's been there. As the afternoon wore on, Maria found herself thinking about mentorship and responsibility. She had been shaped by the soldiers who came before her, who took the time to teach her and guide her through the complexities of military service. Now she was in a position to do the same for the next generation of soldiers. The thought both honored and burdened her. She understood the weight of influence, the way a single conversation could shape a soldier's perspective and potentially save lives down the line. It was a responsibility she did not take lightly. Evening formation approached, and with it the possibility of Morrison's public apology. Maria hoped he would follow through on his commitment, not for her own sake, but for the sake of the message it would send to the other soldiers in their unit. As she prepared for the formation, Maria thought about the events of the past 24 hours and how they fit into the larger pattern of her military career. She had faced skepticism and prejudice before, and she would undoubtedly face it again. But each confrontation was an opportunity to change minds and challenge assumptions. The question was whether Morrison had truly learned from their conversation, or whether he was simply going through the motions of making amends. She would know soon enough. The evening formation was scheduled for 1800 hours, and soldiers began gathering on the parade ground 15 minutes early. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the assembled troops. Maria stood with her squad, maintaining the rigid posture that military formations demanded, but her attention was focused on Lieutenant Morrison, who stood at the front with the other officers. Captain Reynolds, the company commander, called the formation to attention and began with the usual announcements: upcoming training exercises, policy updates, administrative reminders. Maria had heard variations of these same announcements hundreds of times over her career, but tonight she found herself more alert than usual, waiting to see if Morrison would follow through on his promise. Before we dismiss, Captain Reynolds said, Lieutenant Morrison has something he would like to address. Morrison stepped forward, his posture straight, but his face showing the strain of what he was about to do. Public apologies were never easy in the military, where maintaining face and authority were considered essential to effective leadership. Earlier this week, I made some comments that were inappropriate and disrespectful to the women serving in our unit, Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly across the formation. I want to publicly apologize for those comments and acknowledge that they were based on ignorance rather than fact. A murmur rippled through the assembled soldiers. Public apologies from officers were rare enough to be noteworthy, and many of the troops were clearly curious about what had prompted this one. I made assumptions about the combat effectiveness of female soldiers that were not only wrong, but also harmful to unit cohesion and morale, Morrison continued. These assumptions were based on outdated stereotypes rather than the demonstrated capabilities of the women who serve alongside us. Maria watched his face as he spoke, looking for signs of sincerity or mere obligation. What she saw was a young officer who was genuinely struggling with his own preconceptions and trying to do the right thing, even at the cost of some personal embarrassment. I want to specifically apologize to Staff Sergeant Gonzalez and to all the women in our company for questioning their capabilities and dedication, Morrison said. Your service record speaks for itself, and I should have taken the time to learn about your experiences before making uninformed comments. He paused, looking directly at Maria for a moment before continuing. Moving forward, I am committed to judging all soldiers based on their individual merit, training, and performance rather than on gender or any other irrelevant factors. I expect all personnel under my command to do the same. Captain Reynolds nodded approvingly and dismissed the formation. As soldiers began to disperse, Maria noticed that many of them were looking in her direction with expressions of curiosity and respect. The public nature of Morrison's apology had inadvertently highlighted her service record and combat experience in a way that she found both gratifying and uncomfortable. Corporal Rodriguez fell in a step beside her as they walked back toward the barracks. "That's a guts," he said. "Not many officers would be willing to eat crow like that in front of the whole company." "He did the right thing," Maria replied. "Think it will make a difference?" Maria considered the question. "Maybe. At least people know where he stands now." As they approached the barracks, Private Thompson caught up with them. "Sergeant Gonzalez, some of us were wondering, would you be willing to talk to us about your combat experience? Not the kills," he added quickly, "but the other stuff. What it's really like over there." The request surprised her. In her experience, soldiers rarely asked for detailed accounts of combat operations unless they were about to deploy themselves. But there was something in Thompson's voice that suggested genuine curiosity rather than morbid fascination. "Why do you want to know?" "Because most of us have never been in a real firefight," Thompson admitted. "We've done the training, we've run the exercises, but we don't know what it's actually like when people are shooting back." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "It would help to hear from someone who's been there. Someone we trust." Maria looked around at the small group of soldiers who had gathered, drawn by the conversation. They were young, most of them, and eager in the way that only soldiers who had never seen combat could be. She remembered being that age, that eager, that ignorant of what war actually entailed. "All right," she said finally, "but not here. If we're going to have this conversation, we'll do it properly." She arranged to meet with them in one of the smaller briefing rooms after evening chow. Word spread quickly, as it always did, and by the time she arrived at the designated room, she found nearly 20 soldiers waiting for her. Morrison was among them, sitting in the back row with a notebook in his lap. Maria stood at the front of the room, looking out at the expectant faces. She had given briefings and debriefings before, but this was different. This was more personal, more vulnerable. "Before we start," she said, "I want to establish some ground rules. This is not entertainment. These are real events that happened to real people, and some of those people died. If you're looking for war stories to tell your friends, you're in the wrong place." The room fell silent, and she could see that her words had had the intended effect. The expressions on the soldiers' faces shifted from curiosity to something more serious. "Second, everything we discuss here stays here. Some of what I'm going to tell you is classified, and all of it is personal. I'm sharing it with you because I think it might help you understand what you're training for, but it's not for public consumption." Nods around the room indicated understanding and agreement. "Finally, if at any point this becomes too difficult for you to hear, you're free to leave. No questions asked, no judgment rendered." She sat down on the edge of the desk, assuming a more informal posture. "My first deployment was to Afghanistan in 2017. I was 22 years old, fresh out of advanced training, and absolutely certain that I knew everything there was to know about being a soldier." A few chuckles from the audience suggested they could relate to that particular form of youthful arrogance. "I was assigned to a forward operating base in Helmand Province, and my first real taste of combat came 3 weeks into the deployment. We were conducting a routine patrol when we walked into an ambush." She paused, remembering the weight of her gear, the heat of the Afghan sun, the sudden explosive violence that had shattered the quiet morning. "The first thing you need to understand about combat is that it's nothing like training. In training, you know when the exercise starts and when it ends. You know that the bullets aren't real and that you'll be going home for dinner. In combat, there are no time limits and no safety nets." Thompson raised his hand. "What was it like when the shooting started?" "Confusing," Maria replied without hesitation. "Incredibly confusing. The sound of gunfire echoes off mountains and buildings in ways that make it hard to determine where it's coming from. Add in the sound of explosions, people shouting orders, wounded soldiers screaming for medics. It's chaos." She stood up and began pacing, using movement to help organize her thoughts. "My squad leader was hit in the first seconds of the ambush. took a round through the shoulder that spun him around and dropped him behind a low wall. Suddenly, I was in charge of 3 other soldiers, and none of us had any idea what we were supposed to do. "What did you do?" Davis asked. I fell back on my training. Not the tactics. Those went out the window immediately. But the basics. Breathe. Think. Move. Communicate. I got on the radio and reported our situation. I identified where the enemy fire was coming from. I started returning fire. Morrison was taking notes. She noticed, writing quickly in his notebook. The engagement lasted about 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. Time does strange things under stress. Some moments stretch out forever, and others pass in the blink of an eye. She described the tactical situation, the decisions she had made, the mistakes she had learned from. She talked about the importance of communication, of staying calm under pressure, of trusting the soldiers around you. How many enemy combatants were there? Rodriguez asked. Intelligence estimated 8 to 10, based on the volume of fire and the positions they were shooting from. We never got an exact count. Did you get them all? Maria shook her head. No, they broke contact and withdrew after about 15 minutes. That's another thing that movies get wrong. Most firefights end not because one side is completely eliminated, but because one side decides the cost is too high and disengages. She went on to describe other operations, other firefights, painting a picture of modern warfare that was far more complex and morally ambiguous than most of the soldiers had imagined. She talked about the difficulty of distinguishing between combatants and civilians, about the split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. The hardest part, she said, isn't pulling the trigger when you need to. The hardest part is living with the consequences afterward. What do you mean? Thompson asked. I mean that every person you kill in combat was somebody before they became your enemy. They had families, friends, dreams, fears. They were human beings, just like us, who happened to be on the other side of conflict. The room was completely silent now, all attention focused on her words. That doesn't mean their deaths weren't necessary. Sometimes killing people is the only way to protect the people you're responsible for. But it does mean that you carry those deaths with you for the rest of your life. She described her first confirmed kill, the 16-year-old boy she had mentioned to Morrison earlier. She talked about the moment of decision, the squeeze of the trigger, the way the boy had fallen and not gotten back up. I knew it was the right decision tactically, she said. He was armed. He was part of an attacking force. He posed a clear threat to my unit. But knowing it was right didn't make it easy. Morrison raised his hand. How do you deal with that? The emotional aftermath. Therapy helps. Talking to other soldiers who have been through similar experiences helps. Writing in a journal helps. Time helps, but it doesn't heal everything. She looked around the room at the young faces staring back at her. Some of you will never see combat. The nature of modern warfare means that many military personnel serve their entire careers without ever firing a shot in anger. But for those of you who do face that situation, you need to understand that it will change you. Change you how? Davis asked. It makes you older, for one thing. Not physically, but mentally. You see things that most people never see, do things that most people never have to do. It gives you a different perspective on life and death, on what's important and what's not. She sat back down on the edge of the desk. It also makes you more aware of your own mortality. In civilian life, most people live with the comfortable illusion that they're going to live forever. In combat, that illusion is stripped away very quickly. Thompson raised his hand again. Do you regret joining the military? Knowing what you know now. Maria considered the question carefully. It was something she asked herself occasionally, usually in the dark hours of the night when memories of Afghanistan and Iraq made sleep impossible. No, she said finally. I don't regret it. This job has cost me a lot. Relationships, peace of mind, a certain innocence about the world. But it's also given me purpose, discipline, and the knowledge that I've made a difference. What kind of difference? Rodriguez asked. I've saved lives, not just through the kills I've made, but through the missions I've completed, the soldiers I've trained, the objectives I've accomplished. I've helped protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She stood up, signaling that the session was coming to an end. But here's the most important thing I can tell you, she said. If you do find yourself in combat, remember that your primary responsibility is not to your country or to your mission. It's to the soldiers standing next to you. Your job is to bring your team home alive. What if the mission requires sacrifice? Morrison asked quietly. Then you make sure that any sacrifice is necessary and meaningful. You don't waste lives on pointless objectives or because of poor planning or bad intelligence. Every decision you make should be guided by the question, is this worth someone dying for? The weight of that responsibility settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Maria could see it in their faces. The realization that military service was not just about following orders and completing training exercises, but about making life and death decisions that would echo through families and communities. As the session broke up and soldiers began filing out, Morrison approached her. "Thank you," he said simply. "I learned more in the last hour than I did in 6 months of officer training." "Just remember it," Maria replied. "And when the time comes to put it into practice, don't let your ego get in the way of good judgment." Morrison nodded and left, still clutching his notebook filled with observations and insights. Rodriguez lingered as well. "Think it did any good? All that talking?" "Maybe," Maria said. "At the very least, they have a better idea of what they're signing up for." As she walked back to her quarters that evening, Maria reflected on the day's events. The confrontation with Morrison, his public apology, the informal briefing session, all of it had been emotionally draining in different ways. But she felt a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she had made a difference, however small. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to shape the soldiers under her command. But tonight, she had done what she could to prepare them for the realities they might face. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had helped to break down a few more barriers and challenge a few more assumptions about what women could accomplish in uniform. 3 weeks after the mess hall incident, Maria found herself sitting across from Colonel Patricia Hayes in the base commander's office. The colonel was a veteran of 22 years, someone who had fought her own battles against military prejudice and climbed the ranks through determination and exceptional performance. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the ribbons of multiple deployments and commendations. "I've been hearing interesting reports about you," Staff Sergeant Colonel Hayes said, reviewing a file on her desk. Maria sat at attention, uncertain whether this meeting was positive or negative in nature. "Mom." Lieutenant Morrison submitted a rather unusual report about an incident in the mess hall. He also included a request for a commendation for outstanding leadership and mentorship. This caught Maria off guard. She had not expected Morrison to file any kind of formal report, much less a positive one. "I see you're surprised," the colonel continued. "Morrison wrote that your response to his inappropriate comments not only corrected his misconceptions, but also provided a valuable learning opportunity for the entire unit." Colonel Hayes closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "He also mentioned that you've been conducting informal briefings about combat experience for soldiers preparing for deployment. Is that accurate?" "Yes, ma'am. Some of the younger soldiers asked questions about what to expect, and I thought it might be helpful to share some insights." "What kind of insights?" Maria chose her words carefully. "Practical information about the realities of combat operations, the difference between training and actual engagement, how to maintain focus under stress, that sort of thing." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "How many soldiers have attended these sessions?" "It started with about 20, but word has spread. The last session had nearly 40 people. "Including soldiers from other companies?" "Yes, ma'am." Colonel Hayes stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the afternoon training activities taking place on the base. "Staff Sergeant, I'm going to make you an offer that I want you to consider carefully." Maria waited, maintaining her posture, but feeling increasingly curious about where this conversation was heading. The Army is implementing a new program designed to help soldiers understand the psychological and practical aspects of modern warfare. We need experienced NCOs to help develop the curriculum and serve as instructors. The colonel turned back to face her. "Based on the reports I've received about your informal briefings, and given your extensive combat experience, I believe you would be an ideal candidate for this program." "What would that involve, ma'am?" "Initially, it would mean rotating to Fort Benning to help design the training modules. Eventually, you will be traveling to various bases to conduct training sessions for soldiers preparing for deployment." Maria processed this information, recognizing both the opportunity and the challenges it would present. Would this be a permanent change of assignment? Not necessarily. The initial commitment would be for 18 months, after which you could return to a regular unit assignment if you chose. However, there would likely be opportunities to continue in this role if you found it fulfilling. The offer was tempting. Maria had discovered that she enjoyed teaching and mentoring other soldiers, and the chance to make a broader impact was appealing. But it would also mean leaving her current unit and the soldiers she had been training and leading. "I can see you have concerns," Colonel Hayes said. "What are they?" "My current unit, ma'am. I feel responsible for the soldiers I'm working with now, especially some of the newer personnel who are still learning." The colonel smiled slightly. "That's exactly the kind of response I was hoping for. Someone who takes their mentorship responsibilities seriously is exactly what this program needs." She returned to her desk and picked up another file. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Take some time to think about it. Discuss it with your family if you have one. But I want you to know that this opportunity could significantly advance your career while also allowing you to make a real difference in how we prepare soldiers for combat." Maria nodded. "How long do I have to decide?" 2 weeks. If you're interested, there will be an interview process and some additional evaluation, but based on your record and the recommendations I've received, I'm confident you would be selected." As Maria left the colonel's office, her mind was racing with possibilities and concerns. The opportunity was exactly the kind of career advancement that could set her up for promotion to senior NCO ranks. It would also allow her to influence how the military prepared soldiers for the realities of warfare, potentially preventing some of the mistakes and misconceptions she had observed throughout her career. But it would also mean leaving behind the day-to-day work of leading soldiers that had defined her military service. There was something to be said for the direct impact of training and mentoring individual soldiers for being present when they needed guidance or support. She found herself walking toward the motor pool, where she knew Corporal Rodriguez would be conducting maintenance on their unit's vehicles. She often went there when she needed to think, finding the familiar routine of mechanical work soothing. Rodriguez looked up from the engine he was working on when she approached. "You look like someone who just got interesting news," he observed. Something like that. She picked up a wrench and began helping him with the maintenance work, using the familiar motions to organize her thoughts. "Want to talk about it?" Maria explained the colonel's offer while they worked, outlining both the opportunities and the challenges it would present. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting her work through her thoughts aloud. "Sounds like a good opportunity," he said when she finished. "Chance to make a bigger impact. But is it the right kind of impact?" Maria asked. "I mean, working with soldiers on a base like this, you can see the results of your efforts. You know the people you're helping, you can track their progress, you can be there when they need support. And with the new position, you'd be helping a lot more soldiers, but from a distance." "Exactly." She tightened a bolt with more force than necessary. "It's the difference between depth and breadth, I guess." Rodriguez wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the vehicle. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. What do you think is the biggest problem facing soldiers today? Not tactically, but personally." The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, from all your experience, what's the one thing that you think soldiers struggle with most?" Maria considered the question while she continued working. "Understanding what they've signed up for, I think. Most people join the military with ideas about service and heroism and defending the country, which are all good things. But they don't understand the personal cost, the psychological cost, that and the moral complexity, the fact that sometimes doing the right thing still feels wrong, the fact that you can follow all the rules and do everything by the book and still end up in situations where people die unnecessarily." She set down her tools and faced Rodriguez directly. "I think a lot of the problems soldiers have with PTSD, with adjustment issues, with feeling disconnected from civilian society, come from the gap between what they expected military service to be and what it actually is." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "And you think you could help bridge that gap?" "Maybe. If I could help soldiers understand the realities before they face them, if I could give them tools for processing difficult experiences, if I could help them maintain their sense of purpose even when things get complicated." "Sounds like you've already made your decision." Maria realized he was right. In talking through her concerns and motivations, she had clarified her own thinking about the opportunity. "I think I have," she admitted. That evening, she called her sister Carmen in Phoenix. Carmen was 3 years younger and had chosen a completely different path: marriage, children, a civilian career in accounting. But she had always been Maria's closest confidant and most trusted advisor. "A teaching position," Carmen said after Maria explained the offer. "That sounds perfect for you." "Why do you say that?" "Because you've always been good at explaining things to people. Even when we were kids, you were the one who helped me with homework and taught me how to ride a bike, and explained why boys acted the way they did. Maria smiled at the memory. This is a little different from helping with algebra homework. Is it though? I mean, the subject matter is different, but the core skill is the same. You're good at taking complex information and making it understandable. You're good at helping people learn from your mistakes instead of making their own. Carmen paused, and Maria could hear the sound of children playing in the background. Besides, Carmen continued, you've been doing this informally for years. Every time you call to talk about work, you're processing some situation where you had to teach a younger soldier something important. This would just be making that official. What about the travel? The time away from a regular unit? What about it? Maria, you've been deployed multiple times. You've spent years of your life away from home base. At least with this job, you'd be traveling within the country, and you'd be coming home regularly. After they ended the call, Maria sat in her quarters writing in her journal, a practice she had maintained since her first deployment. The physical act of writing helped her process complex emotions and decisions. Carmen is right, she wrote. I've been doing this kind of teaching informally for years. The formal position would just give me more opportunities to reach more people. She paused, pen hovering over the page. But there's something else. I think part of my reluctance comes from fear that I'm not qualified for this kind of role. Talking to soldiers one-on-one or in small groups is one thing. Developing curriculum and conducting formal training is something else entirely. The admission surprised her. She was not someone who typically doubted her own capabilities, but the prospect of this new role seemed to expose some deeper insecurities. Maybe that's exactly why I should do it, she continued writing. Because if I'm feeling uncertain about my qualifications, then I'll work harder to prepare, to learn, to do the job right. The next morning brought news that would influence her decision in unexpected ways. During the morning formation, Captain Reynolds announced that their unit had received deployment orders. They would be shipping out to Syria in 8 weeks to support ongoing operations there. After the formation, Maria found Morrison approaching her with a concerned expression. Sergeant, can I talk to you privately? They walked to a quiet area behind the administrative building, away from the bustle of morning activities. I wanted to ask you something, Morrison said. About the deployment. What about it? I'm nervous, he admitted. This will be my first combat deployment, and I keep thinking about everything you told us in that briefing session. About how training doesn't really prepare you for the real thing. Maria studied his face, seeing genuine concern rather than the bravado that had characterized his earlier interactions. That's normal, she said. Anyone who isn't at least a little nervous about their first deployment either hasn't been paying attention or isn't being honest with themselves. How do I prepare? I mean, really prepare, not just the official training, but the mental preparation. The question crystallized something for Maria. Here was a young officer, someone who had initially been skeptical of her capabilities, now asking for her guidance as he prepared to lead soldiers into combat. The conversation represented exactly the kind of impact she hoped to have through the teaching position. Read everything you can about the area we're going to, she said. Not just the military briefings, but the history, the culture, the politics. Understand why the conflict exists and what the different factions are fighting for. Morrison was taking mental notes, she could tell. Second, spend time with your soldiers. Really get to know them. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their families back home. In combat, you're not just responsible for completing missions. You're responsible for bringing people home. What else? Trust your NCOs. We're there to support you and to provide the experience you don't have yet. Don't let pride or ego get in the way of accepting help when you need it. Morrison nodded solemnly. Will you be there? To help, I mean. The question hung in the air between them, and Maria realized that her answer would determine not just her immediate future, but the trajectory of her entire career. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I've been offered another assignment, something that might take me away from a unit. What kind of assignment? Maria explained the teaching opportunity, watching Morrison's reaction carefully. That sounds like an amazing opportunity, he said when she finished. But I have to admit, I was hoping you'd be there for this deployment. I feel like I still have a lot to learn from you. You'll do fine, Maria assured him. And there are other experienced NCOs in the unit who can provide guidance. But even as she said the words, Maria felt a pull towards staying with the unit, toward being there to support Morrison and the other soldiers as they faced their first combat deployment. That afternoon, she requested a meeting with Colonel Hayes to discuss her decision. She found the colonel in her office reviewing deployment preparations. Staff Sergeant Gonzalez, Colonel Hayes said, looking up from her paperwork. I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Have you made a decision about the teaching position? I have, ma'am, but I wanted to ask about timing. What kind of timing issues? Our unit just received deployment orders. We ship out in 8 weeks. Maria paused. Would it be possible to defer the teaching assignment until after this deployment? Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, studying Maria's face. You want to deploy with your current unit instead of taking the teaching position? I want to do both, ma'am. I think the teaching position would be valuable for my career and for the soldiers I could help. But I also feel responsible for the soldiers in my current unit, especially given that many of them will be facing their first combat deployment. The colonel was quiet for a moment, considering the request. The timing for the teaching position was somewhat flexible, she said finally. The program is still being developed, so there's no immediate urgency. A delay of 6 to 9 months might actually be beneficial, as it would give you recent combat experience to draw from in your teaching. Maria felt a surge of relief and excitement. So you would be willing to hold the position? I can't guarantee anything, but I can certainly explore the possibility. It would mean that you would deploy with your current unit, complete that assignment, and then rotate to the teaching position. That would be ideal, ma'am. Colonel Hayes made a note in Maria's file. I'll make some inquiries and get back to you within a week. In the meantime, you should focus on preparing your soldiers for deployment. As Maria left the colonel's office, she felt a sense of satisfaction that came from finding a solution that honored both her ambitions and her responsibilities. The prospect of deploying with her unit, of being there to support Morrison and the other soldiers during their first combat experience, felt right in a way that taking the teaching position immediately had not. But she also understood that this decision carried its own risks. Deployments were dangerous, and there was always the possibility that she would not return to take advantage of the teaching opportunity. Combat had a way of changing plans and priorities in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. Still, as she walked across the base, watching her soldiers prepare for the challenges ahead, Maria knew she had made the right choice. Her responsibility to the people under her command took precedence over her career ambitions, just as it always had. And perhaps she thought that was exactly the kind of attitude that would make her a better teacher when the time came. 18 months later, Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez stood before a classroom of 42 soldiers at Fort Benning, Georgia. The deployment to Syria had ended 6 months ago, and she was now 3 months into her new role as an instructor in the Army's Combat Reality Training Program. The windowless room was equipped with modern audiovisual equipment and comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle, designed to facilitate discussion rather than traditional lecture-style teaching. The soldiers facing her were a diverse group, men and women ranging in age from 19 to 35, representing different ranks, specialties, and levels of experience. Some were preparing for their first deployment, while others were veterans of multiple tours who had volunteered to attend the training as a refresher or to help mentor younger soldiers. Good morning, Maria began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of leading troops in combat. I'm Staff Sergeant Gonzalez, and for the next 3 days, we're going to be discussing the psychological and emotional realities of combat operations. She clicked a remote, and the wall-mounted screen displayed a photograph of soldiers in full combat gear moving through a destroyed urban environment. Before we begin, I want to establish something important. This is not a tactical training course. You've already received tactical training, and you'll continue to receive it throughout your careers. This course is about something else entirely. It's about understanding what happens inside your head and your heart when the shooting starts. A young soldier in the front row raised her hand. Sergeant, is it true that you have 37 confirmed kills? Maria had been expecting this question. Her reputation had grown considerably since the incident with Lieutenant Morrison, partly because of official recognition of her service, but mostly through the informal network of military gossip that spread information faster than any official communication system. That number is accurate, Maria replied. But I want to be clear about something from the start. This course is not about celebrating violence or glorifying war. Those 37 people I killed were human beings with families and dreams and fears just like us. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a simple black screen with white text. Every decision in combat has consequences that last forever. The purpose of this training is to help you understand those consequences and to prepare you mentally for the decisions you might have to make in combat situations. Over the course of the morning, Maria guided the soldiers through a series of discussions and exercises designed to challenge their assumptions about warfare and help them understand the psychological pressures they would face. She used examples from her own experience, but she also drew on the experiences of other soldiers who had shared their stories with her during her preparation for this role. "Let me tell you about a soldier I'll call Martinez," she said, settling into one of the chairs to create a more informal atmosphere. Martinez was deployed to Afghanistan in 2018. He was a good soldier, well-trained, dedicated, physically fit. 3 weeks into his deployment, his unit was conducting a routine patrol when they came under fire. The room was completely silent, 42 soldiers hanging on every word. The firefight lasted about 10 minutes. When it was over, Martinez had killed 2 enemy combatants and helped save the lives of several wounded members of his unit. By any objective measure, he had performed his duties exactly as he was trained to do. Maria paused, letting the information settle. 6 months later, Martinez was back home on leave, and he found himself unable to sleep, unable to concentrate, unable to enjoy activities that had previously brought him pleasure. He was experiencing flashbacks and nightmares. He felt disconnected from his family and friends. She looked around the room, making eye contact with individual soldiers. Martinez was suffering from what we now recognize as a normal psychological response to combat trauma. But because he didn't understand that his reactions were normal, he thought something was wrong with him. He thought he was weak or broken. A sergeant in the 3rd row raised his hand. What happened to him? Eventually, Martinez sought help. He worked with a therapist who specialized in combat trauma, and he learned coping strategies that helped him process his experiences. It took time, but he was able to return to full duty and complete his military service successfully. Maria clicked to the next slide, which displayed the contact information for various mental health resources available to military personnel. The point of Martinez's story is not that everyone will experience trauma from combat. The point is that if you do experience these kinds of reactions, it doesn't mean you're weak or unsuited for military service. It means you're human. During the afternoon session, Maria introduced a more challenging topic: the moral complexity of modern warfare. "How many of you have been taught that there are clear good guys and bad guys in war?" she asked. Most of the hands in the room went up. "That's what I was taught too," Maria said. And in some conflicts, that's essentially true. World War II, for example, was a war with relatively clear moral lines. She clicked to a slide showing a map of Syria with various faction territories marked in different colors. But modern warfare is often much more complicated. In Syria, where my unit deployed last year, there are at least 7 different factions fighting, and they're not all fighting for the same reasons or using the same methods. She spent the next hour walking the soldiers through the complexity of the Syrian conflict, helping them understand how difficult it could be to determine who was an enemy and who was a civilian caught in the middle of a war they didn't choose. This complexity creates psychological stress that our training doesn't always prepare us for, Maria explained. When you're taught to think in terms of good guys and bad guys, but the reality on the ground is much more ambiguous, it can create cognitive dissonance that affects your decision-making and your mental health. A corporal in the back row raised his hand. "How do you deal with that? When you can't tell who the good guys are?" "You fall back on your rules of engagement and your training," Maria replied. "But you also accept that some situations don't have clear right answers. Sometimes you have to make the best decision you can with incomplete information and then live with the consequences." She described an incident from her deployment to Syria where her unit had been tasked with providing security for a humanitarian aid convoy. They had received intelligence that the convoy might be targeted by insurgents, but they had also been warned that any aggressive action could endanger the civilians they were trying to help. "We spent 6 hours moving through territory where any building could have contained hostile fighters," Maria said. "Every decision, whether to investigate a suspicious vehicle, whether to enter a building to clear it, whether to engage potential threats, carried the risk of either failing to protect the convoy or accidentally harming innocent people. The convoy had made it through safely, but the psychological toll of maintaining that level of vigilance and decision-making under pressure had been significant for everyone involved. The important thing is to understand that these moral complexities are part of modern warfare," Maria concluded. "Accepting that complexity and learning to function effectively despite it is part of being a professional soldier." On the second day of training, Maria introduced role-playing exercises designed to help soldiers practice decision-making under pressure. She had developed these exercises based on real situations she and other veterans had faced, but she modified them to remove specific identifying details. "Corporal Johnson," she said to a young soldier in the second row, "you're the squad leader. Your unit is conducting a routine patrol in an urban area when you receive reports of suspicious activity in a building ahead." She outlined the scenario in detail: intelligence reports, environmental factors, available resources, time constraints. Then, she put Johnson in the position of having to make decisions about how to proceed. "What's your first priority?" Maria asked. "Securing the safety of my squad," Johnson replied. "Good. How do you do that?" Johnson thought for a moment. "I establish a perimeter and gather more information before proceeding." "What kind of information do you need?" The exercise continued for 20 minutes, with Maria asking increasingly complex questions and introducing new complications that forced Johnson to adapt his plans. Other soldiers in the class observed and then provided feedback on his decision-making process. "The goal of these exercises," Maria explained, "isn't to find the one right answer. It's to practice the process of making decisions under pressure and to understand how stress affects your thinking." By the end of the second day, the atmosphere in the classroom had shifted significantly. The soldiers had moved from the eager enthusiasm that characterized the beginning of the course to a more sobered understanding of what they might face in combat situations. During the evening break, several soldiers approached Maria with personal questions and concerns. "Sergeant," said Private Davis, a young woman who reminded Maria of herself at that age, "I'm worried that I won't be able to handle it if I have to kill someone." "That's a normal concern," Maria replied. "And honestly, there's no way to know for sure how you'll react until you're in that situation. Did you know? Before your first deployment?" Maria shook her head. "I had no idea. I thought I was prepared, but nothing really prepares you for that moment when you have to make the decision to take someone's life. How do you know if you made the right choice? You follow your training and your rules of engagement. You consider the threat to yourself and to others. You make the best decision you can with the information available at the time." Maria paused. "And then you live with the consequences, whatever they are." The final day of training focused on post-combat care and long-term psychological health. Maria brought in a military therapist who specialized in combat trauma, and together they discussed the resources available to soldiers who were struggling with the aftermath of combat experiences. "The most important thing to understand," the therapist explained, "is that seeking help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of professionalism and self-awareness." Maria added her own perspective. "Some of the strongest soldiers I know have worked with therapists to process their combat experiences. Taking care of your mental health is just as important as taking care of your physical health." As the 3-day course concluded, Maria asked each soldier to write a brief reflection on what they had learned and how they felt about their upcoming deployments. The responses varied, but several themes emerged. Many soldiers expressed gratitude for the honest discussion of combat realities. Others wrote about feeling better prepared for the psychological challenges they might face. A few admitted that the course had made them more nervous about deployment, but they also acknowledged that this nervousness was probably more realistic than their previous confidence. Private Davis wrote, "I still don't know if I'll be able to handle killing someone, but at least now I understand that it's normal to be uncertain. I also know where to get help if I need it." Corporal Johnson wrote, "The decision-making exercises showed me that there usually isn't one right answer in combat situations. That's scary, but it's also helpful to know ahead of time." After the soldiers had filed out of the classroom, Maria sat alone reviewing their written responses and reflecting on her own journey from combat soldier to instructor. The teaching position had turned out to be everything she had hoped for, and more. She was able to use her experiences to help prepare other soldiers for the realities of warfare, while also continuing to grow and develop her own understanding of military service. The Syrian deployment had provided her with fresh experiences and perspectives that enhanced her teaching. Leading Morrison and the other young soldiers through their first combat deployment had given her new insights into the challenges facing inexperienced troops. Morrison himself had performed well during the deployment, growing from an uncertain young officer into a competent leader who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. He had written to her recently, describing his new assignment and thanking her for the mentorship that had helped shape his approach to leadership. "I think about our conversation in the mess hall almost every day," he had written. Not because I'm proud of what I said, but because it reminds me of the importance of listening to experienced soldiers and not making assumptions based on limited knowledge. That evening, Maria called her sister Carmen to share her reflections on the training course. "It sounds like you found your calling," Carmen said after Maria described the past 3